The day they dragged Elias Cade down from the mountain, the sky was the color of a bruise. Not a storm sky. Not a sunset. Something in between, like the heavens themselves couldn't decide whether to grieve or celebrate what was about to happen in the town of Harrow's Gulch, New Mexico Territory, 1883. They said Elias Cade was half bear and half ghost. That he'd lived alone in the San Cristobal Range for 11 years without once setting foot in town. That he'd survived a Comanche raid, a rock slide, and a winter that killed every mule within 40 miles. Men who'd glimpsed him through rifle scopes described someone enormous, shaggy-haired, leather-faced, moving through the pines like something the wilderness had grown on its own. Nobody dragged Elias Cade anywhere. Until they did. 4 armed men rode up to his cabin on a Tuesday morning. Not outlaws. Not bounty hunters. Worse, they were town councilmen. And they had papers. Legal papers signed by a circuit judge 3 counties over. Papers that said Elias Cade, by virtue of his claim on land that the Harrow's Gulch Water Authority needed for a new irrigation channel, was obligated to either surrender his mountain or comply with a settlement agreement that included, and this is where it gets strange, marriage. Marriage to Clara Dunmore. Clara Dunmore, whom every soul in Harrow's Gulch called the Old Maid. 37 years old. Schoolteacher. Daughter of the late Reverend Dunmore. Quiet. Plain. Unremarkable, they said. The kind of woman people looked through rather than at. Elias Cade looked at those papers, looked at those 4 men sitting nervous on their horses, and he said exactly 6 words. What does the woman want? Nobody had thought to ask her. And that right there, should have told everyone in Harrow's Gulch exactly what kind of story they were walking into. Because the question wasn't what Elias wanted. It wasn't about the land, or the water rights, or the political maneuvering of small men with large ambitions. It was about Clara. And Clara Dunmore, it turned out, had been waiting her entire life for someone to ask. Harrow's Gulch was the kind of town that had survived by being useful and died a little by being proud. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, the kind of geography that trapped heat in summer and shadow in winter. So that the town never got quite enough of anything good, and always got too much of everything hard. The main street was packed dirt and ambition, a general store, a livery, a courthouse the size of a generous outhouse, a church with a bell that rang off-key, and a saloon called the Copper Nail that smelled of tobacco and broken promises year-round. The people of Harrow's Gulch were not bad people, mostly. They were scared people. And scared people in small places tend to organize their fears into rules. Who belonged? Who didn't? Who was respectable? Who wasn't? Who could be used, and how? Clara Dunmore had been useful since she was 12 years old. She taught school in a 1-room building at the edge of town since she was 19, after her father, Reverend Thomas Dunmore, fell from a church roof he was repairing himself because the congregation's donation plate never quite stretched far enough. He survived the fall but not the winter. Left Clara with a small house, a modest library, and a reputation for being good, the kind of good that people admire from a comfortable distance, and never invite to supper. She was plain, they said. They meant she was not married. In Harrow's Gulch in 1883, these were considered the same thing. She had a straight back and careful hands and eyes that were a quiet, steady gray, the color of sky before snow. She spoke when spoken to. She graded papers by lamplight. She planted a kitchen garden every spring and put up preserves every autumn and attended church every Sunday, sitting in the 3rd pew from the front, alone. No one was cruel to her. They simply forgot she had an interior life. That was their mistake. When Council Chairman Horace Briggs first proposed the arrangement, sitting in the back room of the Copper Nail with 3 other councilmen and a bottle of Kentucky whiskey, it wasn't cruelty that drove him. It was arithmetic. The San Cristobal Water Project was going to make Harrow's Gulch prosperous, maybe for the first time in its short and struggling history. A channel from the mountain snowmelt could irrigate 300 acres of desert flatland. 300 acres meant farms. Farms meant families. Families meant permanence, commerce, growth. And sitting directly across the path of that irrigation channel was 11 acres of mountain land legally owned by a man who hadn't spoken to another human being since Rutherford Hayes was president. Buying Elias Cade out was the obvious solution. They'd tried. Twice. Letters sent up the mountain via a nervous courier boy. No response. A personal visit from Briggs himself, which ended with Briggs riding back down the trail faster than was dignified. Having caught one glimpse of the man emerging from the tree line with an axe over one shoulder, and no expression whatsoever on his face. So they got creative. They hired a lawyer from Santa Fe who found an obscure territorial statute, one of those half-finished legal instruments written by legislators who never expected to be held to them, that allowed a municipality to compel land arrangement through what was called a settlement covenant, in cases of civic necessity. The statute's language was tortured and almost certainly unconstitutional, but the nearest federal judge was 2 weeks' ride away. And local judges in New Mexico Territory in 1883 were generally cooperative with men who bought them dinner. The covenant required Cade to either accept monetary compensation, which he'd refused, or enter into a civic agreement that tied his land to a local resident, creating what the statute called a community anchor. In plain language, he had to marry someone from Harrow's Gulch, making him legally a resident, subjecting his land to local jurisdiction, and opening it to municipal easement rights. It was legally dubious. It was morally questionable. It was exactly the kind of thing that happens in small places when powerful men need something from powerless ones. And the woman they chose for the arrangement was Clara Dunmore, because she had no family to object, no suitor to complicate matters. And because, and Briggs actually said this out loud over his whiskey, she ought to be grateful for the opportunity. 3 of the 4 councilmen nodded. The 4th, a younger man named Deacon Wells, stared at his glass and said nothing. He would remember that silence for the rest of his life. When the 4 riders came down from the mountain with Elias Cade riding between them, not quite under arrest, not quite free, the whole town came out to look. And what they saw was not what they expected. They expected a wild man. Something disheveled and broken, maybe. Something that would confirm their comfortable story about themselves, that they were civilization, and he was not. What they saw was a man of about 45, tall and iron-shouldered, with a brown beard going silver at the edges and eyes the dark amber color of creek water over rock. He rode straight in the saddle. He looked at the town with no expression they could read, which was somehow more unsettling than hostility would have been. He looked at the courthouse. He looked at the copper nail. He looked at the church. And then he looked at the small woman standing at the edge of the crowd in a gray dress with a book under her arm, the only person in Harrow's Gulch, it seemed, who hadn't come out to gawk at him as though he were livestock at auction. She was looking at the mountains behind him, like she was saying goodbye to something. Or hello? Elias Cade watched Clara Dunmore for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Horace Briggs and said quietly in a voice rough from years of disuse, "I want to speak with her. Alone. Before any papers are signed." Briggs started to object. "Alone," Cade said again. And something in how he said it made Briggs step back. They gave them 15 minutes in the churchyard. Briggs insisted on 20 feet of distance between them and the church wall, where he stationed 2 of his men. Not close enough to hear. Close enough to intervene. Clara walked to the far end of the yard, past her father's grave, a modest stone she'd paid for herself. $1 a month for 3 years to the stonecutter in Albuquerque, and stopped beneath a cottonwood tree that was just beginning to turn gold at the edges. October was coming. The air smelled of dry grass and distant rain that would likely never arrive. Elias Cade stood a respectful distance away and looked at her directly. Not the way men in town looked at her, past her, around her, through her. At her. "They say you're a schoolteacher," he said. I am, she said. 18 children, ages 6 to 14. Reading, arithmetic, some history. You know what they've arranged. I do. She looked at him steadily. Do you? Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe, that she was sharper than the situation suggested. I know they want my land and they've found a legal mechanism to take it. I know you've been selected because you have no one to protect you. Clara was quiet for a moment. A dry wind moved through the cottonwood above them, scattering a handful of yellow leaves. My father used to say, she said, that a cage is still a cage whether it's made of iron bars or legal language. Cade looked at her. What do you want, Miss Dunmore? She didn't answer immediately. That was one of the things about Clara that made people uncomfortable. She thought before she spoke. In a town full of people who spoke before they thought, this was interpreted as slowness. It wasn't. What I want, she said carefully, and what I'll accept are two different things. What I'll accept is this arrangement, on conditions. What conditions? That it is an arrangement in the true sense, clear and honest between the two of us. Whatever performance we offer the town. That you treat me as a partner, not a convenience. That my school continues uninterrupted. She paused. And that when this is over, if it ever is over, I have something that's mine. Kate studied her. What kind of something? Land, she said simply. 5 acres of your mountain. Deeded to me, clear title, in writing, before any covenant is signed. The silence between them was long enough that one of Briggs's men shifted his weight nervously. You've thought about this, Kate said. I've been waiting for someone to give me a reason to think, she replied. No one did. Until now. Cade was quiet. He looked at the cottonwood, at the graves, at the thin line of mountains visible above the rooftops of Harrow's Gulch. He looked like a man doing calculations that had nothing to do with numbers. What would you do with 5 mountain acres? He asked. Build a library, she said. And plant an orchard. It was such a specific answer, so completely without performance or apology, that something shifted in Elias Cade's face. Not dramatically. Just a small realignment, like a stone that's been sitting at an angle finally finding level ground. All right, he said. All right to which part? All of it. Clara held his gaze for another moment, then nodded once. She opened the book she'd been carrying. He could see now it was a ledger, not a novel, and produced a folded piece of paper from inside the front cover. She handed it to him. He unfolded it. Read it. It was a brief, handwritten property agreement, transferring 5 acres of mountain land. She had apparently done enough research to identify exactly which 5 acres she wanted. And she mapped them with enough precision that a surveyor could find them, to Clara and Dunmore, to be executed simultaneously with any civic covenant agreement. Cade looked up from the paper. When did you write this? 3 days ago, she said. When I heard what they were planning. He almost smiled. Almost. And if I'd refused? Then I'd have refused the arrangement myself, she said. And let them find another way to steal your land without me. There was something in that, the alignment of their positions. The shared understanding that they were both being used by the same small men for the same small reasons, that created a thread between them. Thin. Fragile. But there. Why didn't you refuse? Kate asked. Before they rode up to get me. You could have said no. Clara looked at her father's grave. At the plain stone. At the small plot of Harrow's Gulch ground where Thomas Dunmore lay, a good man who'd fixed other people's roofs until he couldn't fix his own. Because I want the 5 acres, she said. And because... She stopped. Seemed to decide something. Because I think you're the first person in this town who's asked me what I want, and you've known me for 4 minutes. Kate said nothing. That's not nothing, she added. In my experience. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. He turned and looked at Briggs across the churchyard, the chairman standing with his thumbs in his waistcoat, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believes he has managed a situation. "One more thing," Cade said without turning back to her. "Yes? I have a dog. He'll want to sleep by the fire." Clara blinked. Something small and almost impossible moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that lived in the narrow country between them. "What's his name?" she asked. "Trouble," said Elias Cade. "Fitting," said Clara Dunmore. They walked back toward Horace Briggs together, and neither of them looked like what the town expected. Neither of them looked like victims. Briggs, had he been paying attention, might have worried. He wasn't paying attention. The ceremony was brief and undignified. Judge Carver, a narrow, wine-nosed man who presided over Harrow's Gulch's legal affairs with the enthusiasm of someone completing paperwork, read the words fast and flat, as though speed would excuse the transaction. The Copper Nails back room smelled of stale beer and ambition. Horace Briggs stood witness with a proprietary satisfaction that turned more than one's stomach in the room, though no one said so out loud. Deacon Wells, the youngest councilman, signed as secondary witness. His hand was steady. His face was not. Clara wore her Sunday dress, gray wool, pressed and clean, with small pearl buttons at the collar. She'd done her hair. Not elaborately, but done. The kind of care that said, "I will not be made small by this day." Elias Cade wore what he'd ridden in wearing, canvas trousers, a dark wool shirt, trail-worn boots. He'd combed his beard with what a careful observer might have noted was unusual effort for a man described as half-animal by local mythology. He held his hat in his hands throughout the ceremony, turning it slowly by the brim in a gesture that might have been nervousness in another man, but in Cade seemed more like patience. The patience of someone who knows this moment is not the real moment. That the real moment is still coming. When the judge said, "You may express marital acknowledgement," because he couldn't bring himself to say "you may kiss the bride" given the circumstances, Elias Cade turned to Clara and offered his hand. Just his hand. She shook it. Briggs laughed. Cade's expression did not change. By noon, the papers were signed, the covenant recorded, and the first survey crew was already heading up the mountain trail to mark the irrigation channel route. By mid-afternoon, Elias Cade and Clara Dunmore, Cade, now, legally, were walking side by side through Harrow's Gulch's main street toward the small house Clara had inherited from her father. While the town watched from behind window glass and hitching posts with the combined expression of people who don't know how to categorize what they're seeing. The dog Trouble arrived that evening, having apparently made his own way down the mountain with the efficient self-direction of an animal who never needed human instruction. He was enormous, a mixed breed of indeterminate ancestry that leaned heavily toward wolf in the structural sense, gray and black with amber eyes that were disconcertingly similar to his owner's. He walked straight through Clara's front door without waiting to be invited, turned 3 times in front of the fireplace, and lay down. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Well?" she said. Trouble thumped his tail once on the floorboards. Diplomatic, but non-committal. The first week was strange in the way that arrangements between strangers always are, a careful navigation of space and silence, the negotiation of habit. Cade slept in the back room. He rose before dawn. He did not speak much, but what he said was direct and without performance. He fixed the front gate, which had been listing for 2 years. He chopped enough wood to last 3 winters and stacked it with the precise, unconscious artistry of a man who'd kept himself alive in the cold for a decade. Clara taught school from 7 until 3. She graded papers in the evenings. She cooked supper, simple food, good food, and set 2 plates without ceremony. She did not ask questions she didn't need answers to. She did not attempt to fill silence with noise. Cade noticed. On the 6th day, he brought her a cedar box he'd made from wood he'd cut and dried himself, smooth-planed, fitted with a small brass latch, smelling of mountain and resin. He set it on the kitchen table without explanation. She opened it. Inside were 12 small books, hand-bound, covers of oilskin, pages of thin paper covered in small, careful handwriting. "What are these?" she asked. "Things I learned," he said. "On the mountain. About plants. Water. Weather. Soil." He was looking at the wall slightly to the left of her face. "I thought for the library. Eventually." Clara touched the first book gently, with the reverence of someone who understood what it meant to put knowledge into permanent form. "Did you write these yourself?" she asked. "Over 11 years," he said. "Nothing else to do in winter." She looked up at him. Something passed between them, not yet what it would become, but the early shape of it. Recognition, maybe? The specific relief of being recognized by someone who hasn't been told who you are. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back outside. But the town, meanwhile, was not standing still. Horace Briggs's survey crew returned from the mountain on the 4th day with news that shouldn't have been a problem but was. The 5 acres that Clara had insisted be deeded to her, those specific 5 acres she'd mapped with precise and deliberate care, sat directly above the spring that fed the proposed irrigation channel. Not adjacent. Above. The 5 acres controlled the water source. Briggs had been too confident, too certain of his superior cleverness, to read the agreement carefully before signing it. His lawyer in Santa Fe, informed by telegraph, responded with 3 words: "Read it again." Briggs read it again. His face went a color that men in Harrow's Gulch would remember for years. Clara Dunmore, Clara Cade, had not only secured herself land. She had secured the most strategically valuable piece of land on the mountain. The San Cristobal Water Project, the thing Briggs had arranged this entire monstrous situation to obtain, could not proceed without her permission. She'd known. She'd known from the start. 3 days before any of this began, she had done her research, chosen her acres, and written her agreement. And now she held what Briggs needed. He sent a message to the schoolhouse that Thursday afternoon. Polite language. A request to meet. The language of a man who believes manners can substitute for respect. Clara read the note. Set it aside. Finished grading her papers. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. "I'm available Saturday. Bring the full council. And your lawyer, if he's willing to make the ride." Saturday came in hard and bright, the kind of autumn morning that makes the high desert look like a painting of itself, all burnt sienna and bone white. With a sky so blue it seemed almost theatrical. The full council assembled at the schoolhouse at 10 o'clock, which meant Horace Briggs, Deacon Wells, Fletcher Ames the dry goods merchant, and old Cyrus Holt who owned the livery and hadn't formed a strong opinion about anything since 1871. Briggs's Santa Fe lawyer, a slick, city-dressed man named Aldridge, had made the ride and was already suggesting, via his posture alone, that he considered this entire situation beneath his education. They arranged themselves in the children's seats, a humiliation they hadn't anticipated, since there were no adult chairs in the schoolhouse, and Clara had not provided any. Clara stood at the front of the room. Behind her, on the blackboard, she'd written 3 words in her neat, precise teacher's hand: land. Water. Terms. Briggs opened his mouth. "I'll begin," Clara said pleasantly, in exactly the tone she used to quiet a room of 18 loud children. Briggs closed his mouth. "The 5 acres deeded to me include Cress Falls Spring," she said. "I believe you know this now, since your surveyor has been back twice. The spring generates approximately 40 gallons per minute in dry season and substantially more in wet season. Without easement access through my land, your irrigation channel terminates 2 miles short of the flatlands you want to develop." She paused. "This is not a coincidence." Aldridge, the lawyer, leaned forward. "Mrs. Cade, I want you to understand that the original covenant was signed voluntarily by my husband," Clara said. "After I had already secured this deed in the same signing. Everything is legal." She looked at him pleasantly. I believe you know this, or you wouldn't have made the ride. Aldrich said nothing. He'd made the ride. What is it you want? Briggs said. His voice had the flattened quality of a man consciously controlling himself. More money? A buyout? No, Clara said. Then what? She turned to the blackboard and wrote beneath the 3 words. The council watched. Even Aldrich leaned to read. She'd written 5 items. She read them aloud. First, the schoolhouse building, currently rented from the town at a fee she'd been paying for 18 years, would be transferred to her outright, free and clear, in perpetuity, for the purpose of public education. Second, a permanent library building, to be constructed at town expense on the half-acre adjacent to the school, within 14 months. She had a specific design in mind. She produced a hand-drawn plan. Third, a formal town acknowledgement, in writing, filed with the county, that the cave land on the San Cristobal Mountain was private property to be approached only with the permission of its owners. Both owners. Fourth, a modest but specific stipend, to be paid quarterly from the water project's operating revenue once it was established, in compensation for the ongoing use of the Crest Falls Spring watershed. Fifth, Deacon Wells to be elevated to council chairman within 6 months, replacing Briggs, who would retain his seat but relinquish executive authority. Silence. It was the kind of silence that has different textures depending on who you are. For Briggs, it was the silence of a man watching the world rearrange itself around him without his permission. For Aldrich, it was the silence of professional recalibration, the recognition that the woman at the blackboard had outprepared everyone in the room. For Deacon Wells, it was something else entirely. Something that started in the chest and moved upward. You can't dictate council composition, Briggs said finally. His voice had gone very flat. No, Clara agreed. That's a request. The first 4 are requirements. She folded her hands. The easement is worth significantly more than what I'm asking. We both know that. I'm not being greedy. I'm being fair. Whether you can recognize the difference is your business. Fletcher Ames, who had been silent throughout and was sweating through his collar despite the October chill, said, Horace. Maybe we should be quiet, Fletcher, Briggs said. Maybe Fletcher shouldn't, Clara said. Mr. Ames, what do you think? Ames blinked at being directly addressed. He was a man accustomed to existing in the background of other people's arguments. He looked at Clara, then at Briggs, then at the 5 items on the blackboard. I think, Ames said slowly, that it's a fair arrangement. Briggs looked at Ames as though seeing him for the first time. And not favorably. Cade had said nothing throughout. He'd sat in the back of the room against the wall, arms folded, trouble at his feet, with the air of a man watching weather move in from a distance. Not disengaged. Present. The way a mountain is present, not participating in what happens at its base, but determining the landscape in which everything happens. Once, Briggs looked at him, seemingly hoping for some masculine solidarity, some suggestion that the husband might reign in the wife. Cade met his eyes and said nothing. Which was its own kind of answer. Briggs spent 40 minutes trying to find a gap in Clara's terms, a legal ambiguity, a point of weakness. Aldrich tried 3 different arguments. Clara answered each one with the patient, slightly tired precision of a schoolteacher who has explained long division for the 15th time. There was no gap. There was no ambiguity. She'd closed everything. At 11:30, Horace Briggs stood up from a child's chair that had been punishing his back for 90 minutes and said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very old, I'll need to consult with, of course, Clara said. Take the week. The spring will still be mine on Monday. He left without another word. Aldrich followed. Fletcher Ames paused at the door and turned back. Mrs. Kate, he said. Where'd you learn to do all this? Clara tilted her head slightly. I've been teaching children to read contracts, maps, and legal language for 18 years, Mr. Ames. A pause. No one ever thought to wonder what I'd done with the education. Ames left. Deacon Wells was last. He stood at the door and looked at her, really looked, the way the fourth councilman had failed to look on the night in the Copper Nail when Briggs said she should be grateful. The way that younger, uncertain man had failed to speak up. "I'm sorry," Wells said. "For my part in Build the Library," Clara said. "That'll do." But Horace Briggs was not a man who accepted defeat with grace. He was a man who accepted defeat with planning. The week Clara had given him passed. Then 2 more weeks. The terms went and signed. The council held closed meetings that Deacon Wells attended and left looking troubled. Aldrich had gone back to Santa Fe, but letters traveled between them regularly. Wells intercepted one and read enough to understand that Briggs was pursuing a different strategy now. Not negotiation. Something else. It was Trouble who found the first sign. The dog returned from his customary pre-dawn patrol of the property perimeter, a habit no one had asked him to develop, with mud on his paws that was the wrong color for the street or the kitchen. Garden. Mountain mud. Dark and mineral. He'd been further than usual. Kate saw it and said nothing at the breakfast table. But after Clara left for school, he went out and followed Trouble's route, which led, after 2 miles of careful tracking, to a place on the south face of the San Cristobal foothills where someone had recently been digging. Not mining. Not surveying. Something more deliberate. Someone had been examining the rock formation above Crest's Fall Spring. Testing it, maybe? Looking for a way around it, or a way through. Kate crouched by the disturbed earth for a long time. Trouble sat beside him, patient. A hawk turned slow circles in the blue above. When Clara came home that afternoon, Kate was sitting at the kitchen table with his cedar-bound notebooks open and a hand-drawn map spread across the surface, weighted at the corners by a coffee cup, a canteen, and Trouble's left front paw, which the dog had placed there apparently out of a sense of helpfulness. "He's going to try to redirect the water source," Kate said without preamble. "There's a secondary aquifer on the north slope. It's smaller, maybe a third of the output of the Crest Fall Spring, but it's outside your deed line." Clara set her schoolbooks down. Looked at the map. Saturday. If they channel from the north slope instead, the project still works. Slower. Less profitable. But possible. Cade's finger traced a line on the map. They'd be underground by spring. Digging in winter when no one rides the mountain trail. "How long have you known this was possible?" she asked. "Since the first survey crew came up," he said. "I watched where they went. Watched what they marked." Clara looked at him. "You didn't tell me. You didn't need it yet," he said. "You need it now." It should have irritated her, the withholding, the unilateral timing. And there was something in her expression that acknowledged it might, later. But she was practical before she was wounded. "What do we do?" Kate pulled a second piece of paper from beneath the map. A survey document, technical and precise, showing the North Slope aquifer. The kind of document that required expertise to produce. "I've had 11 years to map this mountain," he said. "Every water source. Every formation. Every underground path." He looked at her steadily. "I filed this survey with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe 2 years ago. Standard practice for mountain claims. It's public record." Clara studied the document. "The North Aquifer is on your claim." "On our claim," he said quietly. "I amended the filing last week." Both names. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of what he'd done, the specific intimacy of someone who includes you in something without being asked. "Elias," Clara said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. He looked at the map. "Why?" she asked. Not suspicious. Genuinely asking. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because they chose you because you had no one. And that was wrong. And I can fix it." A pause, in which he seemed to be choosing carefully among things he could say. And because you asked me what I wanted instead of telling me. I didn't actually. You asked me? Yes, he said. And you answered me honestly. That's not nothing. In my experience. He was giving her own words back to her, and the precision of it, the evidence that he'd kept them, turned them over, held them, did something to the architecture of the silence between them. But this was not a story moving peacefully toward resolution. That same evening, 3 men Clara didn't recognize rode slowly through the main street of Harrow's Gulch. Not council members. Not locals. Men with trailed dust on their coats, and no particular expression on their faces. The specific blankness of men paid to wear it. They stopped at the Copper Nail. They stayed 2 hours. They left. Deacon Wells came to the house that night, hat in hand, pale. He's hired men, Wells said. He couldn't quite look at Clara. He kept looking at Cade instead, which told Cade what kind of men. How many? Cade asked. 3 that I saw. Maybe more. For what? Clara asked. Those she already half knew. Wells looked at his hat. Your deed, he said. If the deed is gone, lost, destroyed, never filed correctly, then the land agreement dissolves. The covenant defaults to the town's interpretation. He looked up. Aldrich found a clause. A narrow one. About documentation. The deed is filed in Santa Fe, Clara said. He can't reach your copy, Wells said. Here. If it's gone, there's a 60-day dispute window during which the project can proceed without clearance. By the time any challenge reaches Santa Fe, the channel would be dug. The water would flow. The damage would be done. Legal remedy would be expensive, slow, and uncertain. They sat with this. He's not going to negotiate, Clara said. Not a question. He's going to take, Cade said. He stood up from the table and looked at Clara with an expression that was steady and clear and carried something in it she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not concern, exactly. Not protectiveness. Something more mutual than either of those. Something that said, we are in this the same amount. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask. How much do you trust me? Clara looked at him for a long moment. More than I did a month ago, she said carefully. What are you going to do? He told her. She was quiet. Then, that's either very clever or very dangerous. Yes, said Elias Cade. What Cade did was simple. What it cost was not. He sent word to 3 men, through channels that Clara didn't ask about and he didn't explain. The mountain network of trappers and drifters and men who lived at the territorial edges and knew each other through necessity rather than choice. The word was brief: Harrow's Gulch. Crest Falls Spring. Thursday night. Witness work only. No shooting unless it starts. The witness work part was deliberate. What Cade understood, from 11 years of watching things from high ground, was that Briggs's men would come for the paper copy of the deed. They would come quietly, at night, to the house. And if they were stopped or scared off, Briggs would simply wait and try again. The only way to end it was to catch them in the act with witnesses who could not be bought or intimidated by a small town council chairman. What he did not anticipate, what neither of them anticipated, was Clara. On Thursday evening, as Cade was preparing to ride for the mountain to position himself and meet his witnesses, Clara came downstairs in her trail coat with her father's Winchester rifle over one shoulder and her land deed in a waterproof oilskin case under her arm. Cade looked at the rifle, then at her face. You know how to use that, he said. Not a question. My father taught me, she said. Before the church consumed him, and he decided it wasn't appropriate. She met his eyes. It's my deed. My land. My fight. It's dangerous. Yes, she said. So is being a woman alone in a town that has spent 18 years deciding what I'm for. He couldn't argue with that. And some part of him, the part that had asked what she wanted before any of this began, didn't want to. They rode together. The mountain at night was a different world, cold and silver dark, smelling of pine resin and the iron bite of altitude. The trail narrowed above the tree line, and the stars came out in their full territorial abundance, unhurried by anything as minor as human drama. Trouble moved ahead of them through the dark, nose down, reading the mountain in the language Cade had never been able to teach to words. Cade's 3 witnesses were already at Crest Falls Spring when they arrived, one a trapper named Jubal who'd known Cade for 8 years. One an Apache scout named Waxfar who'd never given Cade a reason to doubt him. And one a former Pinkerton named Cassidy who'd left the agency over a disagreement about who deserved protection and had been living in the high country for 3 years. All 3 were armed. All 3 were quiet. All 3 looked at Clara with the specific assessment of people accustomed to reading whether someone belongs in a dangerous situation by their bearing rather than their circumstances. Whatever they saw, they nodded. And that was that. They positioned themselves around the spring, Cade and Clara on the high ground above, the 3 witnesses spread through the tree line below. They waited. An hour. 2 hours. The cold pressed in from the stars. Trouble lay flat against the rock beside Clara, his warm weight against her leg, something she would remember later as one of the more comforting things she'd ever experienced. They came at midnight. 4 men, not 3. Moving carefully up the trail with shuttered lanterns. They weren't heading for the spring. They were heading down, away from the mountain. They'd already been to the house. Cade leaned close to Clara and said, barely sound, "They have the deed. The original. The house copy." Clara's hands tightened on the Winchester. "Wait," Cade said, his hand light on her arm. "Let them come down." She waited. The 4 men reached the open ground below the spring. And here was where Cade's plan required something she had not fully calculated: trust. Trust in strangers. Trust in him. Trust that the next 30 seconds would go the right way. Jubal stepped into the trail with a lantern. The 4 men stopped. Hands went to guns. "Easy," Jubal said pleasantly. "You've got rifles on you from 3 directions. This doesn't have to go ugly." A long beat. Then, from the tree line, Waxfar's voice, calm and absolute. "3 rifles. Your choice." The 4 men looked at each other in the lantern light. One of them, the one carrying a saddlebag that clinked with the particular sound of a glass and metal object, like a document case, made a calculation about odds. He made it correctly. "We're just passing through," he said. "Leave the bag," Jubal said. "And keep passing." The man who held the bag set it down in the trail. The 4 of them backed away slowly, and then they were in the dark, and then they were gone, and the sound of horses moving fast down the lower trail dissolved into the mountain's vast silence. Cassidy retrieved the bag. Walked it up to where Cade and Clara stood on the high ground. Clara opened it. The deed was there, in its case, unharmed. She held it in both hands for a moment. Looked at it. Then looked out at the valley below, at the distant scatter of yellow light that was Harrow's Gulch sitting in its shallow bowl, small and bright and certain of its own importance. "It's over?" she asked. "Almost," Cade said. By Friday morning, Deacon Wells had in his possession signed statements from 3 named witnesses, a trapper, a scout, and a former Pinkerton. All prepared to testify, documenting an attempted theft of legal property by persons who could be tied to Horace Briggs through payment records Wells himself produced from the council's discretionary account. By Friday afternoon, Wells had sent copies to the county sheriff, the territorial governor's office, and the newspaper in Albuquerque. By Saturday, Briggs was gone. Just gone, packed in the night, rode north, was heard of later in Colorado under a different name, which suggested this was not his first exit of this kind. The council, with Briggs absent and the story spreading, ratified Clara's original 5 terms by a vote of 3-0. Deacon Wells signed as chairman. The library construction began in March. Spring came late to Harrow's Gulch that year, but when it came fully, all green rush and bird noise and the mountain snow melt arriving right on time. Running clear and cold down the channel that the San Cristobal Water Project finally completed under terms that were fair, documented, and signed by both owners of the Crest Falls Spring watershed. Elias Cade went back to the mountain in November, as he'd always known he would. He was not a town man. He never had been. The wilderness was not something he'd retreated to. It was something he inhabited the way some people inhabit language or music, completely and without apology. But he came down every week. Not because anyone required it. Not because papers said he had to. Because the house on the edge of Harrow's Gulch had a library in it now, a real one. Small and cedar-smelling and filled with 18 children every afternoon and 12 hand-bound notebooks in a place of honor on the top shelf, and because the woman who ran it had started leaving a plate for him at the kitchen table and a lamp in the window, and had never once asked him to be different from what he was. Clara Dunmore, Clara Cade, legally, though she used both names depending on the day and what suited her, taught school for 30 more years. She built the orchard on her 5 mountain acres. She wrote a book, eventually, a history of the San Cristobal watershed, illustrated with hand-drawn maps and botanical observations. Dedicated to the 11 years of careful watching that one man had turned into 12 hand-bound notebooks. In the dedication she wrote, for E.C., who asked first. People in Harrow's Gulch told the story for a long time, about the mountain man who was dragged to town, the old maid who outthought everyone, the council chairman who fled. The spring that changed hands without a single shot being fired in anger. They told it as a love story. They told it as a legal drama. They told it as a cautionary tale about underestimating quiet people. All 3 versions were true. But what stayed with those who knew them, who watched Cade ride down the mountain trail every week and stop at the house with the lamp in the window, was something simpler. Something that didn't require a legal document, or a dramatic confrontation, or a blackboard with 3 words on it to understand. They had asked each other what they wanted. At the very beginning, in the churchyard, under the cottonwood tree, they had done the one thing that small people in small places so rarely bother to do with one another. They had listened to the answer. And in a world that runs on force and assumption and the comfortable fiction that some people don't have interior lives worth considering, that, in the end, was the most radical thing either of them ever did. The Copper Nail closed in 1891. The library is still standing. Trouble lived to 14, which the veterinarian in Albuquerque called medically implausible. Clara said he was just stubborn. Some things last because they're strong. Some things last because they're right. Sometimes you can't tell the difference until the end.